both kind of reactionary and radical thought have, I think, naturally tended to hone in into a critique of the subject. I think that's the kind of expected thing. You would see it. And so amongst 19th century, James, just don't make the face. Reaction is a bad word, isn't it? But say Nietzsche, he talks about the subject. He says that little changeling, the subject. That little changeling, the subject. That's a kind of common, dislike of the idea amongst more sort of reactionary. I'll say reactionary. But even amongst, my subject more is amongst radicals. I think they're equally kind of tempted to critique the idea of the subject. So, as an example, I take the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. And he talks rather funnily about the ego. The ego, he says, is a monster or homunculus. And he makes fun of the idea that there's a presence inside man of the celebrated little fellow who governs him, who is the driver. The idea of this little ego inside who's governing us. And I suppose my headline would be, I think it's expected, it's proper that the different schools of thought will go to the subject in a critical attitude, because that's properly is the highest product of bourgeois. I don't mean that like bad. I mean bourgeois civilization. Its linchpin, its foundation, its most creative thing is this idea of. This idea is wrong. This thing, the subject. And when I say the subject, I mean to say like a free agent, kind of what we've been talking about over the weekend. The willing subject or contracting party. It's important that a subject is a subject which has property and enters into contracts. A voting citizen. These are core. Attainments of bourgeois civilization, and as it were a linchpin. It all turns. You can't understate this. I think. If we could not trust each other as willing contracting parties, what would happen to civilization? If I said yes, I'll do that, and didn't, well, that's true. But if everybody did that all the time, it would be disaster, immediately disaster. So it is central, linchpin, and you think of the importance of it because, no society could be governed by one dictator. It's impossible. All the myriad decisions, perfect, brilliant attainment to make the freedom of each of us be the deciding principle by which all the myriad decisions are made. But I think in the same way, I think the critical dimension of thought will naturally go to that because it is central, because it is right at the core. Here's the thing, the subject, sovereign individual. Here's the very thing which is at the heart of what it is to be in the present, to be in the modern world. And so people that are, as it were, restless or critical or at odds are going to say, well, you're a propagandistic subject. I feel compelled at this point to, let's see if we can put a chink into your armour here and break open this idea. And I think, so that's why you see a lot of this kind of attack on the idea of the subject. And, it's broadened out sometimes, like Michel Foucault, he wrote in about 1968, I think, Man is Dead, in a little article. Is Man Dead? It's actually Homme est-il mort? And Man is Dead, which of course is a kind of joke on Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote God is dead. He said Man is dead. We subtext, we worship man as once we worship God. And I will pull man off his pedestal. Claude Levy Strauss, anthropologist, He said, the ultimate goal of the human sciences is not to constitute but to dissolve man. Not to constitute but to dissolve man. And these are, and you may, given where we are, what we're talking about, you may at this point be thinking, oh, shut up, we're idiots. Man, that's me. You want to dissolve me. But I beg your indulgence because you could say, well, look, there's an assertion here of a commonality of man, which is surely open to critique. When we say mankind, is this avoiding real differences? Is this subsuming real differences of interest or fact or whatever that we ought to attend to? Is this not something monstrous about the idea of man? So I beg your indulgence on that. I want to say that the critique of the subject that I'm taking as core. There are many, but the one that's core, I think, is what we call roughly is structuralism or poststructuralism or deconstruction. And I've got to apologise in a sense because I'm not a deconstructionist, and I think if you really wanted an honest account of deconstruction, you'd probably go to a deconstructionist and get the unalloyed thing. I come as an historian of ideas, I guess, as an historian anyway, and I'm trying to explain certain commonalities of view that might make sense of why they came to the conclusions that they did. And I know that many people have come across, in their studies or work, they've been directed to, perhaps Foucault or Lacan or different people in this school of thought, let's say, and have been a bit found it difficult. It's a bit difficult, and even perhaps pretentiously difficult. Let's say it, that lots of Derrida and Lacan are, it seems, self-consciously cryptic in their mode of expression. And again, I think I just beg your indulgence, really, because and the people have made the charge that this is a fakery. That this is a kind of Mandarin trick. To make you, to intimidate you, to deliberately express yourself in a convoluted way, so that people don't, feel intimidated by the school of thought. And that may be true. I think, that may be true. But I think we have to try and address what we can address. Anyway, so one way I want to address it, which is to talk about where these ideas came from, a bit of a tracing of the genesis. And I want to talk about a pre-existing way of talking, which we call phenomenology, which is a fancy word, but it has a kind of it's not as extraordinary as it seems. I think some people here probably we're familiar with what Kant did. Immanuel Kant. He said, "Look, there's two parts. There's the phenomenon, the bit that we can see, that's recognisable to us, and then there's a beyond, a kind of a noumenon, which we can't see. We can only kind of speculate about, maybe, or it's beyond, which kind of makes." The phenomenon what it is, but it's not accessible to us, and that's this is why phenomenology got the name. Another kind of development was Hegel, George Hegel, the German idealist. He was a bit irritated with Kant and said, "Look, your phenomenon and noumenon are just not getting along. There's too big a gap. I need some more kind of interaction." And he proposes what he calls a phenomenology of spirit, and that's a more dynamic relationship in that spirit, Geist in the German. If you really wanted to be mean about it, you would point out that the etymology is ghost. There's a big ghost in the machine, and the ghost is like God, as it were, or spirit moving through the world. And this is, what lays behind everything that we can see. And the phenomenology of spirit is the phenomenology of spirit because spirit manifests itself in different forms. It becomes accessible to us in different forms, which are artistic or historical or institutional, governmental. And as it passes through, Hegel elaborates further, spirit recognizes itself in its manifestations and moves forward. It's a dynamic relationship. And that was, it was an attractive idea because it seemed a lot, it's like all things bright and beautiful, isn't it? The Lord God made them all. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, he made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. But unlike the vicar's song from the 19th century, there's a dynamic in Hegel which is doesn't leave the poor man at his gate, as we go on to see. So these were the kind of accepted terms. That's where the word phenomenology came from for the phenomenologists, from phenomenology of spirit. But the man who kind of kicked it off, really got the ideas going, Edmund Husserl. I mean, there were others like Alfred Schutz and to some extent Martin Heidegger who developed this idea. And they came to this view that they were frustrated. They were essentially found it too difficult to work with this world divided between a subject and an object. This like, often you see it if you get books about Hume or Locke. Comes a certain point where they illustrate it with a little eyeball. And there's a little eye and it's a kind of dotted line. That's the subject, the seeing subject. And then there's a tree. That'd be the object. Here's the subject. Here's the object. There they are. And Husserl, knowing all the difficulties this caused Kant and Hegel's problems with it, he said, look, this whole subject-object divide is killing us. We're exhausting ourselves talking about all the kind of paradoxes that keep popping out of this world divided between subjects and objects. And he said, I'm not saying it's false or right out. Let's just put it to one side. We'll bracket that question, the subject, the object. We'll put them into brackets, set them aside from each other. And I'll put that in a drawer and forget about it. And I want you to think of the world instead, or you in the world, as all one. There isn't, he said, it's not, there isn't a subject-object divide. That's, I don't understand it. Or he said, just think of it this way, the things of consciousness, the things that present themselves to you, they're not consciousness or they're not phenomenon and noumenon. They're there. They're just there. They're what you can see. This is Ernst Mach's drawing. I promised Jan I would explain this. Ernst Mach drew this. You can't quite see it. I have to go over here when you can't hear me. The nose, there's the nose. This is the eye. He's looking through his own eye. And as he's looking through his own eye, he can see himself in a room. You see? The point being is that in Mach's drawing, the subject and the object are combined. There is no differentiation. I am in the world. There's not a world here, an objective world here, and a subject as it were, distantiated apart from it. I am in the world, me here. And he's saying, well, this is this is the first step, and lots of phenomenological writing begins with something a bit like Ernst Mach's drawing. I'm looking, I'm here, I see this thing, and you kind of relax that whole subject, object over here, subject over here kind of distinction, and then you can just kind of get on with describing the way the world is. There's a couple of other steps which I can't do justice to, but roughly he then moves quite quickly to the fact that as you are in the world, so too is all the other people, or are all the other people. All those other people there too for you to see and to be with, and and their writing, and their pictures. And so there's a kind of, and he calls it a life world. It's a life world. There's subject-object combined, a life world. It's, there isn't a world with life. That would, we'd all suffocate, wouldn't we, out there in space? And it's very kind of a true thing, isn't it? Because there's never bare nature. There's always you in the world and other people. This is a bit like in Picasso's, in the early Picasso, there's often bits of typeface. He puts in bits of typeface, and you think, well, that doesn't seem right. But of course, as you abstract from the physical world and all the rest of it, typeface is a part of it too. So all of the different meanings that people put into the world, they're in the world too, and that they're as much part of the world as the things that they're about, in the old-fashioned way of thinking of it. And so this is really an intriguing step for him, because what he says is, in this life world, meaning is constructed in this conversation that people have. And this is the bit where he kind of irritated lots of people, because he said, look, sciences, he was a scientist himself, he says science, it really is, it's a formal social activity. It's not an investigation of objective laws. It's an intersubjective agreement. I think he used this phrase. He said we can see the objective sciences as subjective constructs. You see the objective sciences as subjective constructs. And he says the objective, this is a challenge to scientists, is never precisely, the objective is precisely never experienceable as itself. And scientists themselves, by the way, consider it in this way when they interpret it as something metaphysically transcendent, in contrast to their confusingly empiricist talk. It means to say that scientists working in laboratories don't put their hands on nature, as it were. They talk to each other, and they engage in a social practice of which nature is this kind of further distant thing. And the experiments, the different activities that they undertake to construct a conception of nature. I think you can see here lots of modern day thinking about Bruno Latour, for example, and the idea of social construction, that science is a social construction. These are here, I think, in Husserl already. And he also says this about a kind of a cultural interaction. He says, when we're thrown, he says, to emphasise the point, he says, when we're thrown into an alien social sphere, that of the Negroes of the Congo, or Chinese peasants, we discover that their truths, the facts that are for them fixed, generally verifiable or verified, are by no means the same as ours. And he's saying the things that they're absolutely certain of, that they feel that they've discovered and understood, might conflict with our views. But he says, do conflict with our views. Meaning to say that the truths are not established by an interaction of man, metaphysical man, and nature, but in an intersubjective agreement between people, as people would say in modern worlds, as a social construction. I think a lot of, which is very good, by the way, emphasise the social construction impetus in social science research has been really great and has led to lots of interesting things. It does represent some certain difficulties for us. The next thing I'd like to, just slightly turn the corner. I want to talk about another event, as it were, that kind of helped along the development of post-structuralist thinking, and that was this thing that happened in Paris. They'd never bothered to translate Hegel in France. There was no French translations, and so the only way you could read it, as it were, was to go to these lectures that this guy called Alexandre Kojève would give. Kojève, and it's great, by the way, read it. Introduction to the Reading of Hegel is a fabulous, eloquent and readable book. And it's essentially a restating of the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel's book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. And it includes amongst it this rather marvellous dialectic of the master and the slave, or the master and the servant, which comes up a lot. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But when Kojève was doing it, Kojève was a bit more like us, and a bit less like Hegel. Geist wasn't so happy with all that. He wanted to make it, he called it, let's not treat this development of human consciousness as God manifested in the world. Let's make it something more like an anthropogenesis, a human development. He was humanizing Hegel. He was taking the spiritual side out of it, which is, compelling and I think correct in a sense, but in another sense not. And that meant to say that I think the reason that it's not is because the spirit in Hegel, the Geist bit, is the active side. It's the dynamic part. It feels uncomfortable to us to talk about God and stuff, but actually the God is the dynamic which drives forward the development of different forms of consciousness and social life. And without the Geist, it becomes something very different. It becomes, in fact, no longer a phenomenology of spirit, but a phenomenology. It becomes a Husserlian thing. And there's something very important that's lost when you take out the spirit out of the Hegel, because the spirit is the driving force. And so each of these different forms of consciousness that Hegel goes through, he talks about Stoics and skeptics and early Christianity, each of these different forms become lifelessly opposed. Instead of being a part of a development, kind of a transition that moves through, that has a kind of direction and a development, they become just kind of separated, and it's particularly true. I have to do this now. I was kind of hoping somebody else might have done the master-slave dialectic, which I can't possibly do justice to, but you may have heard of it. The idea is there's an elemental struggle for existence. And two men meet. One is courageous beyond belief and doesn't care for his human physical existence, and who believes in the nobility of his spiritual life, and therefore is courageous and puts his human existence in danger, his physical existence. And another man is more like me, I guess, cautious and thinks, well, you live to fight another day and all those things get into trouble. And of course he loses, and he's enslaved. So the master wins, the slave is enslaved. And then there's some weird ironic inversion, as Hegel depicts, 30 years on, the master's big fat all, and this obsequious servant is coming, yes, whatever you want. And Hegel says, look close, you'll understand the servant is the real master, because everything that happens, the servant does. Whereas the master is just appetites, he's just a human appetite. He's become the literal opposite. That's a slight detour. The master and the slave, when you take out the spiritual dimension of that, the transitional dimension, what Hegel sees is it's a transition. It's a fable, obviously, but it's a kind of transition point on the way to a republic, perhaps a democracy. He wasn't as advanced a thinker as that, but it's a staging post. It's a kind of a particular mode. Whereas if you take the spiritual out of it, it just becomes, there is no transcendence. There's no overcoming. There's nothing beyond. There is just, and they become the two master-slave become denatured. As they're dispirited concepts, it becomes self and other. And you can read that in lots of, and the self and other confront each other without ever, there is no reconciliation, it's not possible. Maybe, Hegel's reconciliation is bogus, that's an argument, but I think when you take out the transcendent spiritual dimension, there is only self and other, and lots of writers that were at Kojève's seminar, use those concepts of self and other as essentially irreconcilable positions, that you're always either a self or another, and it's not something that one can move beyond. And I think it appealed, let me introduce my first proper post-structuralist, was Louis Althusser, about whom I said lots of unpleasant things in the book, I really regret. And Althusser was a Marxist. I know lots of people in this room have a great familiarity with Marxism, and you'd be disappointed, I think, if you read Althusser, the Marxist, because he's not that good. He is really interesting kind of a character, but his Marxism's not that good. There were better people working in the similar, he was very interested in different levels. But if you read Roman Rozdolsky around the same time, who's an Hegelian, he's streets ahead. But anyway, who cares? We don't really care whether he's a good Marxist. We're interested in what is the dramatic thing that's going on. This is what he says. He says, Althusser says, look, I'm going to take all the metaphysics out of Marxism, which Marx, he said, was going to do anyway, if only he'd have got around to it. I'm going to make it much more scientific. He thought of it as scientific Marxism. And he said, people say this thing, Marx stood Hegel on his head, made Hegel sensible. He says, but don't be too tempted by that metaphor. He says, because, the relationship, don't use the Hegelian formula, that the relationship between an essence and its phenomena is sublimated in the concept of the truth of, that we can understand the truth of a thing by uncovering the essence behind the phenomena. And he says you don't want to do that. When you flip Hegel over on his head, don't make economics into the truth of society. What we want to do is to get rid entirely of that Hegelian theme of phenomenon, essence, truth of. So he's using these Kojavian phenomenological attack on the spiritual in Hegel, and he's saying, let's dispense with that. And instead of the idea of contradiction, he thinks too mystical, talks about a rather more facile over-determination. These are, some of these are a bit technical, as it would seem, terms. But what he gets to, which I think is close to what we're talking about, he says, instead of seeing this demiurge God marching through history, and us really arms and legs of this thing, he says we need to think of history as a process without a subject. And he felt that this was kind of a scientific approach. He was very tempted by the 1859 preface to the introduction to the contribution to the critique of political economy or something like that, the Marx thing, where he starts with, it's not consciousness that determines being, but on the contrary, it's social being that determines consciousness. So, Althusser kind of glommed onto that part. He loved that, that dehumanized Marx, the Marx of social forces, in which we agents are merely kind of voices of social forces, of relations of production, and so on. I think, so I could stop on the phenomenology there. Talk a bit about the structuralism, and this is kind of hard because there's a lot in, and it's quite weird really that this guy Ferdinand de Saussure was a linguist who had a particular theory of linguistics I can't quite do justice to, I think, in the time, and he said, but what he said was, and it would have been a footnote, perhaps not for linguistics, but I think it would probably have been a footnote for social theory, but for the way it was received. So in Saussure's theory of linguistics, the language is independent of its objects of reference. It's a relationship to itself, and that people are, as it were, speaking, voicing a language that is independent of them. He says, language is not a function of the speaker, is a product that is passively assimilated by the speaker. Another structuralist, structural linguistics, he promises, shifts from the study of conscious linguistic phenomena to the study of their unconscious infrastructure. Well, I'm not so sure. That didn't go down very well. Now, I've just set aside, I'll bracket the question of how, structuralism, is that an important thing for linguistics? But I think more important is that it was taken up, it was adopted, or became a model for a lot of people doing social theory, because they were drawn to the idea of the structure, which determined its different parts. Different parts would become, shaped by the structure, and they would, which preceded them. So Levy Strauss, anthropologist, he said, people said, well, why are you talking about linguistics? You're an anthropologist. He said, language is at once the prototype of the cultural phenomenon and the phenomenon whereby all forms of social life are perpetuated. So language was kind of social relationship, the linguistic form that he got out of Saussure. And he said, linguistics, he says, presents us with a dialectical and totalizing entity, but one outside or beneath consciousness and will. And that he found that, for him it was fruitful in terms of the way he was doing his anthropology. That the idea of social structures as entities independent of man's consciousness of them, though in fact they govern men's existence. Now, maybe, people say that his analyses of kinship groups and marriage and all those different aspects are good, but whatever. But other people, like Levy Strauss, were kind of drawn to this structuralist linguistics as a model of a kind of a social theory without conscious subject, that precedes the conscious subject. So Lacan, he says, the subject is constituted as secondary in relation to the signifier. It's the subject's just an effect of this discourse, of this language. And he talks about Josie's tattooing finally makes an appearance. He talks about notching and tattooing. He said, thus is marked the first split that makes the subject as such distinguish himself from the sign. Maybe this is too weird. Distinguish himself from the sign in relation to which first he's been able to constitute himself as a subject. So we mark ourselves, but we aren't a self until we mark ourselves. The sign makes the subject. It's the opposite of what you would expect, that, in our ordinary way of thinking, we think we're people who say things. We're really subjects who articulate languages. I want to, setting aside the structuralism as a source, I want to talk about the way poststructuralism took its name from structuralism, as it were, but always saw itself as something like a reforming project. In a limited way. You can't have a reforming project which is willfully cryptic and non-communicative to a great number of people. But it was within its world, was a very quite delineated world of the big university in Paris, the top university in Paris, where Derrida and Lacan and Althusser were all lecturers. And amongst the kind of riffing off of each other all the time, and very drawn to this idea of talking about world without subjects or critiquing that whole idea. And so they did propose it as a kind of a reform, and they were going to reform thought. Thought takes some wrong steps. We're going to show how it needed to be reformed. There's a particular word they use a lot, which I think for non-philosophers, which I think are probably a non-philosopher, is slightly intimidating and confusing, which is metaphysics. So it's always the metaphysics. The metaphysics of the nation state, I remember. And when people say, the metaphysics of the nation state, or the metaphysics of masculinity, or the metaphysics of the free subject, you're kind of hearing in your head, that's obviously a bad thing. The metaphysics here is a boo word. Down with metaphysics. That means something like mumbo jumbo or daft, and you never want to be is there something in that? Because then you're daft, aren't you? So it's a boo word. Who wants to be the defender of metaphysical mumbo jumbo? Didn't Hume tell us to cast that book of metaphysics into the fire? Metaphysics, it should say, is a real thing in the development of thought. Might seem a bit archaic now. Aristotle it was called the Metaphysics because it was a book after the physics, so you had to give it a title. It's the book after the physics. Kant, took it, more seriously, and he got in a lot of trouble for it. But in the metaphysical, he included things like things that we might discount, like immortality. Immortality, can't take that seriously. So metaphysical, yeah, right. Toss it in the fire. Some that we might be more sceptical of. Metaphysics was about God. Well, who's that? We never met him. So down with him. But then others which I think we might be more sympathetic to. So in Kant's metaphysics, he includes free will. Free will is a metaphysics. And so if that's all rubbish, as well as dispensing with God and immortality, you're also dispensing with free will. So that, it may be that, when we say that's metaphysics, that some of the things that we're throwing out might be good and worth hanging on to. But for the post-structuralists, it was very much a kind of a campaign to exclude metaphysics, against metaphysics. Lacan talks about the metaphysics of the knowing self, meaning to say, that's mumbo-jumbo. The knowing self, that's mumbo-jumbo. Don't believe it. It's a myth. It's constructed. Derrida talks about the metaphysics of presence, which I think is just too hard to explain. In this book, or this is maybe easier for people interested in politics to understand, in his book, Experience of Freedom, Jean-Luc Nancy argues that our understanding of freedom is metaphysical. And he says, freedom must be freed. Freedom must be freed of its transcendent dreams. Freedom must be freed of its transcendent dreams, which can only be defeated, can only end in, the desire to be, infinite, more. That's insane, you're going to get into trouble. A better idea of freedom, he says, would be something like existence. Existence would be, I kind of gave up quite a lot then, somewhat like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, maybe. But and Derrida follows this too. There's an interesting book. He often avoided politics because he didn't want to get caught out in that rather hothouse political atmosphere. He said, he was talking about Heidegger and people who were angry about Heidegger being a Nazi, as we've heard. And he said, they talk about democracy or human rights. And then he said, skeptically, he said, democracy or human rights, which directly or not comes back to this metaphysics of subjectivity, meaning that human rights, let's say, or democracy, they rest on the idea of a subject, a willing subject, which to Derrida, he doesn't even need to argue it. He pops the word metaphysics on it, and instantaneously it's kind of negated. I'd be a fool to believe in such a thing. Now, Derrida, in his idea so as well as getting rid of metaphysics, or what are you up to, Derrida? And he gave it a name. He talked about deconstruction, which irritated lots of people because there's too many syllables in it. Deconstruction, he said, would be different, he said, from other kinds of criticism. I have to read the quote. He said, the movements of deconstruction do not destroy structures from the outside. They're not possible and effective, nor can they take accurate aim except by inhabiting these structures, operating necessarily from the inside, borrowing all the strategic and economic resources of subversion from the old structure. And the deconstruction really was like this. He was going to introduce nothing new. He was only going to elicit, some people sometimes call this immanent critique, which I don't think quite does justice to what he's saying. But, the idea is we're not going to, we're just going to lay bare the assumptions and you'll see that it's all not as it is. There's a kind of a vulgarizer of it. That's not fair. Lyotard was very good. Lyotard, he kind of pushed them into the next game. And when he put a name on it, he called it, which I think slightly irritated Derrida. He said, I'll call it postmodernity. Postmodernity was a bit more eye-catching. And he explained himself. Let me explain myself. He says, I will use the term modern to designate any science that legitimates itself with reference to a meta-discourse, that's to say something outside of it, making it any science that makes an explicit appeal to some grand narrative. And then he gives examples, grand narratives like dialectics of spirit, or the hermeneutics of meaning, or the emancipation of the rational or working subject, or of the creation of wealth. So those are the versions of the grand narratives that he's going to, and he expresses himself rather well. He says, I define postmodernism as incredulity towards meta-narrative. I think that incredulity, I must be out of time. Okay, so I should have said a bit more about how these things work themselves out in the world, but I think I should keep to my time. There's an advertiser who created a new punctuation which never caught on, which is called the Interrobang. Some of you may know if you're into typefaces. The Interrobang is a combined exclamation mark and question mark. And it means something like this. I think, you know, a lot of the deconstructions, you know, they're eloquent and elegant in the way they do it, but you know, I think Derrida's really right. You know, there isn't anything new introduced, because what they're doing is they lay out the same argument as in a conventional thought, but with an interrobang at the end. You know, the emancipation of labour, and this is so cheap. But what it means is that and this is, I think, was where you can talk about the intelligibility of it as pertaining to something more. And I think why deconstruction kind of took off as a fashion in American and British universities, because it was giving this decoding system, a kind of interrogatory system, to lay bare what was already true, which was that these different ideologies, modern ideologies like the nation state or the free market or the willing subject, were already tottering a bit. You know, were already weak and imperfectly secured, you know, maybe in a way that people hadn't understood. And Derrida and Lyotard are kind of there saying, look, it's not, you know, it's not plausible. What you're saying about the emancipatory subject would have been, it makes sense in 1920 maybe, but you know, in 1990, look at where's your self-emancipation of labour now, mate? Look and see the thing fall down. I think that's probably why they gave a particularly eloquent, maybe cryptic, but eloquent way of critiquing ideologies at a point which would have been less important if it weren't the case already that ideologies themselves were tottering, and they were, as it were, just laying bare some of those weaknesses.
Thank you.